Good afternoon. So good to see you all. Thank you for being here. This is our third speaker this academic year for the Psychology Speaker Series. And today we have with us Dr. Jeffery Kieliszewski. Say it again. Kieliszewski. I knew I was going to mess it up. From the University of Iowa, he has a PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Iowa. He is a fully licensed psychologist here in Grand Rapids, and he also consults on TV and film projects. And so please give him a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank Dr. Christian and the Psychology Department bringing me here to do this talk. And to everybody live streaming out there, hello. Anyway, I'm going to start out by I'll give you a little bit of my background. And so the plan for today is I'm going to go through, I've got slides, I've got an hour and 15 minutes. And what I usually like to do is just bang through the slides, just cruise through those as quick as I can. Because I think what's more interesting, and I would argue maybe you'll get more learning, is when we start taking questions. So if you have questions when we're going through the slides, just please jot those down and wait for the end, okay? So to start out, I'll talk a little bit about my background and how I ended up here and when I used to be there, because I went to community college myself. And I didn't go to college right out of high school. I worked, and nobody in my family ever went to college, and I went to community college part-time, sort of got hooked into the school thing, went on to Grand Valley and got into their special program for first-generation college students, non-traditional students I was called, because I was also independent from my parents. Got my bachelor's degree in psychology at GVSU. Then I went off to Chicago and lived there a couple of years and got a master's degree in clinical psych from Roosevelt University, and then went on to the University of Iowa, where I did 4 years, got my PhD in counseling psychology, and then as part of your PhD in applied psychology, you have to serve a one-year internship. I was fortunate enough to do my internship at the Federal Bureau of Prisons Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky, where I did my training rotations in forensic evaluation, neuropsychological evaluation, and substance abuse programming. And then after I finished school, I came back to Michigan, started working for the Michigan Department of Corrections out in Ionia. And I worked out there about 3 years, and then moved into private practice. And I've been at private practice now for 25 years at a place called HRA Psychological Services. My practice is primarily forensic. Now, let's define forensic psychology. That's a good place to start. So forensic psychology, broadly defined, is the application of psychological science within the legal system. So anytime there's a legal situation and you're applying psychology. Other examples of forensic, I love these pointers. Forensic pathology, that's a medical field where there's a legal issue. So for example, autopsies, cause of death, medical examiners. That's forensic pathology. Forensic science, we all know that one. That's what they make TV shows about, blood splatter analysis and all that kind of stuff, right? So you're applying science to a crime scene in order to be used for legal purposes. Forensic dentistry. Do you know why you'd want to be a forensic? Why would you need a forensic dentist? Well, to identify bodies and bite marks and stuff like that. And forensic accounting, that's when you work for the FBI and you audit someone who is cooking their books. Now, I want to give a little bit of a warning as we jump into this. And my warning is that I talk to naughty people who do bad things all day long. So a lot of times I will talk about these things just sort of casual. But it's not that I'm casual about it. I'm just so used to talking about this stuff. The other thing is, just to sort of take care of yourselves here, I may use some examples that may be a little bit, I don't know, I guess difficult to hear. Examples of cases that I've been on. So again, just to sort of monitor your own reactions, particularly if you have a trauma history, If you have any difficulties with any of the things that I talk about, please seek me out after and we can talk through it, okay? But again, I sometimes, you know, for years, I've been married 25 years, and I remember when we first got together, my wife would be like, you know that story you were telling when we were at the dinner with people? You probably shouldn't tell stories like that to people. Work stories. My work stories are pretty intense sometimes. And it took me a while to go, oh yeah, maybe people don't want to hear about torture and murder. That's just happened, just in the other town over. So anyway, a little bit of a warning that I'm trying to do better to just not blah, 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 but just my little trigger warning. All right. The broad area of forensic psychology. So if we define this as applying psychological science to legal situations, this is sort of the umbrella. And a few of the things we'll get into more detail here in a minute are things like insanity, right? Not guilty by reason of insanity, criminal responsibility, civil commitment. That's when you have to go live at a hospital because you can't take care of yourself because of your mental health issues. And that goes through court. Child custody evaluations. Two parents are fighting over custody of their children. That becomes a legal issue, and sometimes forensic psychologists are involved. Psychological autopsy, what's that? That's after someone passes away, you are tasked with going in to try to understand and describe their frame of mind at the time when they passed away. Why would we want to know this? Well, sometimes there'll be questions of whether or not someone committed suicide, or was it an accident? Other times that I've been hired to do psychological autopsies were on lawsuits. When someone died, for example, a mistreatment in a hospital. And we had to talk about pain and suffering. Other things, jury selection, I'll talk about that in a minute. And you're going to find out it's crap, it doesn't work. Risk for sexual offending, I'll be talking about that in a minute. Sometimes the courts will ask me to do an evaluation of someone to determine their risk to sexually offend against others. Disability, that's a legal issue. There's laws about disability. Fitness to carry a firearm. If someone is being denied a permit to carry a firearm, it's usually due to a mental health treatment history or a legal history. And I won't do those evaluations because the law around that evaluation is pretty weird, and I just won't go near it. It's not a very clear law, and I don't even know anyone who are doing these. And then false confessions. So have you ever heard of false confessions? Someone confessing to a crime they didn't do? I've been hired to do evaluations to try to determine if this is a potential false confession. All right, I need to go faster, right? All right, so as a forensic psychologist, you'll often find yourself in one of three roles. And what's important from the ethical perspective, you have to stay in your role. You can't change. So sometimes, a lot of times, I'm hired as the examiner. I'll be doing psychological evaluations for someone who has a legal issue. All right? I'll get into those more in a minute. Consultant. A consultant, I get hired to actually work on legal cases. Sometimes I get hired to review other psychologists' work. Sometimes I get hired as a consultant in order to help prepare attorneys for cross-examination of expert witness mental health folks. On lawsuits, I'll get hired as a consultant, for example, to look at someone's work to see if they're ethical or meeting standards of practice. And then treater. Really, treater is more you are treating someone who has a legal situation. So if someone has court-ordered psychological therapy, then you could be a forensic treater, because what you're probably going to have to do is write a report that goes to the court. So again, anytime there is a legal situation. All right, applications of forensic psychology. Now, forensic psychologists are actually trained in both psychology and law, okay? So when I went through my forensic training program, I had to read a lot of case law. We were quizzed on things. We had to do mock testimony and cross-examination. So where you apply psychology most commonly, criminal proceedings, pretrial, criminal responsibility or insanity evaluations, or competency to stand trial. I'll talk about those in a minute. I've been hired as a forensic psychologist to do in-trial work. In other words, I sit in the gallery and write notes down and hand it up to the attorney, particularly during cross-examinations. Sentencing. Oftentimes, the court will send someone to me that they want an evaluation to help inform what type of sentence they want to give this person. That particularly happens more in sex cases and some violence cases. And in appeals, I've been hired a few times to work on appeals cases, and that's mostly in the role of a consultant to go through records and try to help the appeals attorney understand what really went on in the trial, the mental health evidence, how that can help in the appeal or not. Civil litigation, those are lawsuits. People are suing each other. I'll get hauled in on those a lot of times for either ethical violations by the treating clinician, or sometimes, if there's emotional damages, what does that look like? What's a treatment need for someone who's been wronged and wins a civil lawsuit? Family court. Those are divorce and custody, parents fighting over custody of their kids. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Also neglect and abuse. People have their children removed by Child Protective Services and put in foster care. And now they need a psychological evaluation before they can start parenting time again, with the goal of reunifying with their child. So I'll do those kind of evaluations. And then probate court, which is guardianship mostly. So does someone need a guardian or a conservator because of some mental disease or defect, or sometimes some medical issues, that they can't carry out those tasks? So they need someone to do those for them. So criminal proceedings, civil, family, and probate is mostly where you're going to see forensic psychologists work. All right. Now, often your task as a forensic psychologist is applying psychological science to a legal principle or statute. So again, that's where you have to be trained in the law and psychology. So let me give you some examples. This is the statute in Michigan. That's Michigan compiled law, section blah, 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 blah. This talks about criminal responsibility, which is in the federal law known as insanity. And here's what the statute, this is word for word what the statute says. If, as a result of mental illness or mental retardation, as defined by MCL this, that a person lacks substantial capacity to appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness of his or her conduct, to conform this conduct to the requirements of the law. Did they know what they were doing was right or wrong? And did they have control over themselves to prohibit that behavior? And the first question is, do they actually have a mental illness or mental retardation? Now, not guilty by reason of insanity, not guilty by reason of criminal responsibility. By the way, there is the federal insanity statute, and if you read it, it's pretty much the same thing, right? Okay. Being not guilty by reason of insanity is extremely hard to pull off. In fact, let me go to my notes here, less than 1% of people who attempt to be not guilty by reason of insanity are successful. The bar is really high. A couple of things that come into play. Now, you may have heard of this in fiction or TV. Now, in the 1970s and up until the early 1980s, insanity laws put the burden of proof on the prosecutor. So the prosecutor had to go in and say, I'm not guilty by reason of insanity. And then the prosecutor has to prove that you were sane. Well, in the early 90s, so that's where you get some of those famous cases, like the Harvey Milk case. Some of these famous cases, they walked by reason of temporary insanity. But that all really changed in the early 1980s, when all of the laws across all the states and the federal law put the burden of proof on the defendant. So now the defendant, they have to go in and prove that they are insane or not criminally responsible and that makes a much higher bar. Other things that always take this off the table, voluntary intoxication. If you got really drunk or really high and did something bad, this is not available to you. Back in the old days, they used to, back in the 70s and before, they could use that, but not anymore. That is off the table. So again, criminal responsibility and insanity evaluations are very difficult. And I can tell you in 25 years, I'm a second opinion a lot on these from what the state doctors say. I would say probably 25 years, I've probably had less than 10 that actually met this criteria. So it's very rare, okay? It's a bit of a myth that you can just go in and pretend you're insane, all right? Okay, so quick example of someone who would be insane. I had a case where a guy was at the VA hospital down in Battle Creek and was very seriously mentally ill. He had schizophrenia, and he signed himself out and walked over to a bank and said, "You SOBs took all my money. Give me my money or I'm going to blow the place up." He had a delusion. They took his money. They handed him a bag of money. He walked across the street to the McDonald's, walked into the McDonald's, puts the bag of money on the counter. It's his money, right? In his delusional mind. Pays for his Egg McMuffin, walks out in front of the McDonald's, a beautiful weekday morning in the summer, sits down on the picnic table when the cops show up. And the cops come over and they said, "What are you doing?" "Having breakfast." "Were you at the bank?" "Yeah, I got my money back." He had no concept of the idea that this was actually wrong, okay? So I'm not giving you any tips if you're going to plead insanity. But here's the deal. If you try to get away, it kind of told us you knew it was wrong, right? You can be mentally ill and still commit a crime, but still be criminally responsible. That makes sense. All right. How are we doing? We're doing okay. All right. Competency to stand trial. There is another law. Now, how do you get all these laws, psychologists, right? So luckily, the American Psychological Association puts a book out like this, Law and Mental Health Professionals, that helps me keep up on all the laws. Have you ever tried to read laws? They're like that, right? But the main thing that I'm doing as a forensic psychologist is I'm pulling something out of the statute that I have to answer for the court. So the other one that's pretty common is competency to stand trial. All right, let me read this one quick. Again, this is Michigan compiled law. A defendant to a criminal charge shall be presumed competent to stand trial, okay? He shall be determined incompetent to stand trial only if he or she is incapable because of his mental condition of understanding the nature and object of the proceedings against him or of assisting in his defense in a rational manner. The ability to perform these tasks reasonably necessary for him to perform in the preparation of his defense and during trial. So what question am I trying to answer when I do an evaluation of competency to stand trial? Number one, is there a mental disease or defect? Is there a mental illness or are there intellectual deficits? Number two, does this person have adequate knowledge in order to go into court to understand what's happening in court? Reasonable understanding, I think they say, right? Of the nature and object of proceedings. And then, will the person be able to assist their attorney? And if the answer that they can't assist their attorney, they can't understand, you need to connect that to the mental illness or the intellectual or cognitive deficits. Another part they talk about is will the person be able to behave in a manner that helps in their defense? So if they go in there and their mental illness is making them hide under the table or scream at the judge, well, they're really not able to do that. Now, this isn't easy either. So competency to stand trial works in about 15% of adult cases that go forward. Now, what happens if you're found not competent? Well, if I'm the examiner and I present an opinion that this person is not competent to stand trial, in the statute, in that book over there, it says the examiner needs to provide an opinion. in regards to the reasonable probability this person can be restored to competency. Michigan law says 15 months, federal law says 18 months. What restored to competency would be, let's say they don't have much of a knowledge and they have a lower IQ. Well, they could go into an education program to learn about how court works with a person, it's usually a psychologist, to to teach this person given their learning disabilities or cognitive deficits. The other one would be they're unmedicated schizophrenic and they're having delusions and hallucinations, so they're not competent. Let's get them on the right medication so that those hallucinations and delusions are either lowered in intensity, frequency, or they're gone so they can be competent. Some people are not restorable, and you have to connect that to the mental illness. If you come in with an IQ of 40, you can't really crank your IQ points up. We can try to educate you, but you're probably not going to be able to. So if a person is not restorable to competency, the examiner has to write that out, why, in the report. And then usually the charges are dropped. Okay? Again, this does not work very often. This statute presents me with those 3 questions that I need to answer, right? Now, here's where it gets more complicated. What if you're a juvenile? Well, in Michigan, up until 2013, we had to do competency evaluations under the adult statute for juveniles. You're 13 years old, you have an IQ of 71, and you're sexually molesting kids under the church steps. I had 3 cases that exact scenario pretty much played out. Well, the church part did. Is this person competent to stand trial? So in 2013, and I usually don't give any kudos to politicians. That's my own little, I've worked with politicians as a consultant. But they did it the right way. They went out and hired the right experts. They looked at what other states are doing. Now 37 states have a juvenile competency statute. And this is what the statute says. It basically follows the basic ideas of tests of competency in the adult statute, but it outlines more requirements for conducting the evaluation. Mandated IQ testing now on every juvenile. Also, it has to be done by a qualified forensic examiner. That's me. I had to go to a training over in Ann Arbor. We also have to do an instrument called the Juvenile Adjudicative Competency Interview. It's a structured interview that goes over various aspects of criminal proceedings. And it also outlines more specific tests of competency relevant to juveniles. And this is a quote, an ability to extend thinking into the future. So you need to know your child development, right? You know, how can a 7-year-old, I did have a 7-year-old competency evaluation. How can a 12-year-old think into the future? Can they think into the future enough to be able to assist in their trial? So it gets real complicated real quick with juveniles. And the other one, does this person have the verbal articulation abilities or the ability to express oneself? And if you say they don't, you need to connect it to something about this person. Is it because of their intellectual deficits? But in the juvenile competency statute, you actually get a little bit more leeway where you can talk about emotional maturity. So these get complicated. Another thing that's really nice in this statute, where for the adults in Michigan, you have to opine an opinion, can they be restored to competency in 15 months? Juveniles, 120 days, so 4 months. Because if you're 13 versus 14 and a half developmentally, there can be a lot of differences there, right? So they did it the right way. This is pretty complicated work, and 2 of us over at my practice are doing this. All right, how are we doing? I'm blowing through. Hope you're not bored yet. I'll tell the good stories in a minute. Guardianship. Again, I'm following the law, right? I'm looking at the statute. So the Michigan probate law talks about an incapacitated person, and they define that, okay? As a person unable to conduct their day-to-day affairs. This person needs to be incapacitated due to mental impairment, retardation, old age, disease. All of these things are outlined and defined in the statute. And the law gets super specific about what you need to have in the report. This is right out of the law. I mean, they talk about a listing of all medications, dosage, prognosis for improvement. So these, again, this is a very much statute-heavy evaluation where the forensic psychologist reads a statute and then moves into answering questions based on that statute. All right. Family law, divorced custody, it's possible, maybe likely, I hope not, that one of you in this room had parents who were fighting over custody of you because they loved you so much to the point where they had to go get psychological evaluations by Dr. Jeff. I hope that didn't happen, but it possibly did. So divorce and custody evaluations are really what's called capacity to parent or fitness to parent evaluations. Now, guess what? There's no statute for capacity to parent. It's not defined in the law, okay? So in Michigan, the judge is supposed to look at all of these 13 factors, 12 factors, in order to weigh in. And sometimes they use psychological evaluations for like G, the mental and physical health of the parties involved, or the moral fitness involved, love and affection. So, since there's no statute telling me what question do you need to answer, I have to go into the professional literature and the research. If you've taken Psych 101, you've probably talked about operationalizing variables. How do we measure them? Well, how do I measure and what questions am I measuring for in a capacity to parent? Basically, those come down to 3 questions. Again, this isn't in the statute, but it's in the professional literature. Does this person have mental illness, major psychological problems, intellectual deficits, or active substance abuse problems? Does the parent have a problem? Number 2, does this person have an adequate and appropriate understanding of child development and parenting issues? Right? Do they have the knowledge base to be a parent and raise a child? And number 3, if there are any deficits or problems outlined above, how does it affect this person's ability to be a parent? So those are the questions. Again, what you saw is I had a nice statute that told me the questions. When you move into family law, you don't have that statute, so you have to go to the research literature and look it up. Now, I used to do a lot of these, but I have now retired from doing family law evaluations. I'm not retired, and why did I quit doing these? Because of family law attorneys. And I've been doing it 20-some years, and they're awful. These people, a lot of times these people aren't crazy. In the court, mom says dad's crazy, dad says mom's crazy. These are people just sort of not acting the right way because of the intense stress they're going through with their family breaking up. So I quit doing those because the family law attorneys are becoming so aggressive now. And I'm dealing with all this crap, like they're writing all this stuff in the court order that Jeff needs to answer. Not those 3 questions, a bunch of other questions that aren't based in any empirical-based research or even professional writings. And then I'd have to email them and say, I can't answer this question, have the order changed. And then, in my opinion, I don't think the attorneys are managing their clients. Go and see Jeff, then we'll win. Well, not necessarily, right? So I quit doing them. And my stress levels dropped immensely, and I'm much happier. 20 years of that crap, I'm done with it. All right. We're cruising. Risk assessment. Guess what? There's no statute that talks about sex offender risk assessment. So what do I need to do? I need to go into the professional literature and the research and see what do you need to look at in a psychological evaluation to determine if someone is at risk to sexually offend. And I will sometimes be hired for risk for violence assessments, either domestic violence, workplace violence, or institutional or school. Every time, here I'm getting blunt again, every time there's a school shooting, I'll get 3 referrals for some kid at a high school that said something dumb or showed a gun online, and now I have to do the risk assessment before they can go back to school. Again, there's no statute, so I go into the professional literature. A lot of the risk assessment models that forensic psychologists use are called actuarial models. And that basically looks at a bunch of variables and which variables are associated with a higher risk to offend. Like your insurance company charges you guys more money because you're younger, right? Why? Because at 22, statistically, you're more likely, or at 19, statistically, you're more likely to get in an accident than an old 58-year-old driving like a grandpa, right? That's what actuarial variables are. So when I do risk assessments, there's some nice empirically scientific-based schedules of different variables. And do you click that box and that box? And how much is that box weighted versus this box? So risk assessment, again, something I don't have a statute for, but I have to look at the research literature. All right, we'll cover this one. We'll fly through this one quick. The forensic psychologist in a consulting role. Now, psychologists in court. What's the history of psychologists in court? Well, the first forensic psychology text is called On the Witness Stand by Hugo Munsterberg. Bought it on eBay. 1913. And Hugo, which is a freaking cool name, don't you think? Any more kids, I call him Hugo. Anyway, the different chapters. In memory of the witness, 1913. Are witness memories accurate? The detection of crime. The traces of emotions. I don't know what that means. I'll have to read that. Untrue confessions. So he's talking about this in 1913, and it's stuff that I'll do now. Hypnosis and crime. The prevention of crime. So pretty interesting little historical book. If you go to graduate school in psychology, hopefully you have to take the history of psychology. I think you still do. Because you have to read these books, and they're pretty interesting. But psychologists in court have a kind of an odd history. Up until the 1970s, psychologists usually were not in court, and there really wasn't anything like a forensic psychologist. Up until the 1970s, there was a lot of social work involved in court, particularly juvenile court, this kind of rehabilitation model. But what happened is in the 1970s and the 1980s, someone said, hey, let's start using psychologists to figure all this stuff out. So, jury selection. Can you hire the forensic psychologist? I've been hired to do that a couple times, by the way, to do jury selection. Okay? Guess what the research says? It doesn't work. But you'll have high-profile cases where they hire a jury consultant. And you talk to any experienced litigating attorney, and they can tell you, good luck trying to figure a jury out. And I've been involved in those cases where going through jury questionnaires, and you can stereotype, oh, let's get so many males, let's get so many females. It doesn't work, okay? That gets played up in fiction a little bit, but you're going to find out quite a bit of forensic psychology does. Specialized expert witness, talked a little bit about this. I've been hired to talk about child development. I just testified in Ottawa County for 3 hours on parent alienation syndrome. I didn't examine anyone, but I talked about the research, and I talked about, based on my experience, what that looks like and what that doesn't look like. Forensic record review, I already talked about that. I do a lot of that. I'll get a big stack of records, and it's kind of a cool gig. Get your coffee going, read, make pretty good dough, and give your opinions to attorneys about what you're finding in the records. What I'm getting more now is lawsuits. And unfortunately, there are some therapists out there that are not acting in an ethical way and not meeting the standards of practice. And I just call it like it is. And then trial preparation, that's mostly consulting, talking with attorneys. Okay, the psychologist from that side is going to come on the stand, look at the reports, Jeff, and tell me where's the weaknesses in their findings. And again, this the whole idea, it's not like trying to get people off, but actually trying to sort of elevate the level of justice in court. So I don't go in there and make up things. But again, if you're doing forensic work and you're not adequately trained, you can go into court and have a huge impact on people's lives. And I can tell you dozens of stories of people who are not forensically trained, and they go into court and wreck people's lives based on their sort of procedures, their findings. I've seen people go to prison for 10 years because a therapist testified that blah, blah, blah. And then, that was an appeal case that was actually overturned. So if you're going to do forensic type work, one of my responsibilities as a forensic psychologist, and I in my opinion, and as a well-trained forensic psychologist, is to help police the profession. This sounds like a crappy thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. There was a family court team that was out in one of these, not Kent County, another county, that was doing absolutely unethical stuff. It was terrible, and people's lives were being torn apart. And I got hired on the case and went out there and went through everything that was happening unethical in this case, really slamming this family court team. And again, I think it was people who had their hearts in the right place, but they weren't doing adequate forensic work. They weren't trained. So anyway, I'm going to take credit for putting them out of business. And it's the idea that now people can get a more fair shake in that particular county. All right, how am I doing? All right, here we go. Let's get real now. But Dr. Jeff, when I become a forensic psychologist, will I be carrying a gun and helping the police track down serial killers? As a forensic psychologist, won't I become a profiler with the FBI or maybe a profiler for the Hudsonville Police Department? I used to pick on Sparta, but now I'm all over Hudsonville. It's probably one of my kids' sports things. They probably lost to Hudsonville or something. But anyway, here's the part in the lecture where I ruin all of your dreams. Guess what? You're not going to get a gun. And like you might see in the movies, you're not going to be in the back of cop cars chasing down serial killers through the woods. If you're learning, what you're learning is it's a very technical job. Believe me, it's an interesting job. But it's not like it's depicted a lot of times in fiction, okay? We'll talk about profiler here in a minute, but I used to have a clip. There used to be a movie in the 90s called Kiss the Girls with Morgan Freeman. Yeah. And the trailer starts out. You see him running through the woods. It's dark and rainy. And he says, I'm a forensic psychologist. I should have put that clip on there. It was kind of cool, actually. But sorry, it doesn't quite go down like that, okay? So forensic psychologists sometimes can be played up in media. All right, so profiling, I always put this on here because it's always a question. Profiling is this thing that was first used by behavioral scientists back, I think, in the 70s. Man, a lot of stuff was going on in the 70s. I was kind of riding my bike playing Little League, which was pretty cool. But so the first behavioral scientist, the first behavioral science unit profiler was a guy who had a bachelor's degree in English from Dartmouth. Wasn't even a psychologist. So what we find, this whole concept and this idea of profiling, obviously it's played up in fiction. There is an FBI behavioral science unit. And what they really do is they're used to try to help catch bad guys. But there's no empirically or scientifically backed technique for profiling. Okay? Now, profiling is most of the time, where are we talking about here? Not a validated technique. Profiling is usually based on actuarial sets. Again, we're going to collect variables. What variables are associated or correlated with this particular behavior? Now, if you want to do, if you had some statistics already, if you want to do profiling using actuarial variables on serial killers, not a lot of serial killers. Pretty small sample size, right? So when you want to do actuarial variables, you need a big sample size. You need 3 million 19-year-olds who are wrecking mom and dad's cars all the time, right? But so the problem is these data sets are not big enough to actually have any scientifically robust conclusion from profiling. It's not accepted in court. Let me tell you what, if I ever went into court and said, oh, this guy fits the profile, the judge would flip out, okay? And the last one, some concern about false positives. I got to get new examples. I was already complaining about this because I'm getting way too old, and all my examples are from the 90s when I was a professor and I used to teach all this stuff. But One of the problems with this profiling idea is there's a lot of false positives. Every guy who sets a bomb someplace is a 35-year-old overweight white male who lives with his mom. You ever hear Richard Jewell? They made a movie about him. He was a security guard at the Atlanta Olympics, I think in the 90s, and someone put a bomb, a backpack bomb, and blew up and killed some people. And he was in the area, and the FBI zeroed in on him. And he was a 35-year-old overweight security guard guy who lived with his mom, and it ruined his life. He wasn't the guy. So a lot of concern about false positives with profiling. So it's not used. Now, the FBI Behavioral Science Unit is still around. And they do assist in crimes, but they don't do this whole profiling thing. They might look for some clues that would lead them to ask better questions or go investigate in other areas. Okay, they might know that the potential killer did this or that. Well, in our database, other killers have done this and that have been sort of like this. So why don't you go check this area out? But this idea about completely profiling a killer just doesn't have any scientific integrity. Okay. What is a typical day like in the work of a forensic psychologist? So, how are we doing? Oh, we're doing good. We're going to have a full half hour of questions. All right. A typical day for me, I might come in at 7:30, go through my emails, have a little breakfast at my desk, and then at 8:30, I have a person who's coming in for a capacity parent evaluation because their children were removed and they're placed in foster care. So I'll do that interview and look at the records and put them in testing. And then my next appointment might be a person who's applied for Social Security disability. There's a law of disability. I might see that person. And then the next person that I might see could be somebody that has been plea bargained a criminal sexual conduct case, plea bargained it down, and the judge wants an evaluation to determine whether or not, what type of sentence this person could get or should get, and are they a danger. Typically, if they're higher risk, they're going to give them more time, right? And then have my lunch while I'm looking at some records, and then I got to run out to juvenile detention because there's a kid in there that needs competency evaluation. And then I do that, and then I come back, and let's say I got another 2 hours left in my day. Well, I got a set of records that an attorney sent me to go through, and I'll go through those records in order to provide some consultation. And then the next day, I get up the next day, and I got to go over to Flint and see a kid at Whaley Children's Hospital. I had to do it last week. Who's in there? He's on, and there's a question of his competency to stand trial. And then I get back, and I've got a couple that their kids were removed, and they need a capacity to parent. All right. And then the next day, I have to go to the Ottawa County Jail to see a person in there because there's a question of their criminal responsibility. The Forensic Center, the state docs in Ann Arbor said they don't have they are criminally responsible, and the attorney wants me to provide a second opinion. So, and then my Fridays, I don't see any people. I dictate reports all day long. And I usually try to get up in the morning with my coffee and edit a report or two and send it off to the attorney, the social service worker, case worker, okay? I'm busy. People continue to mistreat each other. I definitely have job security. I'm also very fortunate that I had really good training, and there's a lot of stuff that I can do in forensic psychology that a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to have that kind of training. How do you become a forensic psychologist? So I'll talk about my YouTube channel here in a minute, do some promotion, but I have a good video on this. The main thing to become a forensic psychologist, number one, you got to become a psychologist. Duh, right? But the point is we're all trained as a general practitioner psychologist, and then you move on to more advanced training to become a forensic psychologist. So I learned about psychotherapy. I've had jobs where I've done counseling. In my practice, I used to do counseling, but I'm not doing it anymore. Not court ordered like regular people, right? But The key is you have to get the type of degree where you can get a license to practice psychology. At least once a month, I get an email that says, hey, Dr. Jeff, I went and got my master's degree in forensic psychology from so-and-so university. I can't get a job. Why? Because you don't have a professional license to practice. Usually it's got to be, to get a license to practice, so the top level is a PhD in clinical psychology or counseling psychology, and that's 4 years after your bachelor's. There are folks who can get a master's degree, and in Michigan we have a tiered license system. I'm called a fully licensed psychologist because I don't need anyone to supervise me. I can practice independently. But in Michigan, we have a master's level psychologist and a master's level psychologist. I call them LLPs, limited licensed psychologists. You need to have a fully licensed person supervise you. So I've got one person that I supervise. The reality is that you can try to work as a forensic psychologist with a master's degree, but it's a lot tougher. Some courts may not accept you. They say, no, we want the PhD. Now, here's a big distinction. There's a thing called correctional psychology, which you probably saw in one of the first slides, and forensic psychology. Correctional psychologists, I used to be one, are psychologists who work in prisons. And that can be pretty interesting. You're not doing forensic evaluations. You're not looking at statutes and interpreting those into questions to answer the court. But what you are doing is you're working with prison populations. You might be providing assessments to inmates. You might be providing treatment, group, individual. You might be consulting with different units. And again, I worked in prisons for 7 years, and I did all correctional psychology for those 7 years. And well, except when I was at the feds, I did do it's right in my training, right? So if you're interested in crime in this population and you go, oh, dude, I don't have time and money to go get a PhD. Kidding me? You can't get a master's degree and go work for the Michigan Department of Corrections. So correctional psychology, forensic psychology, by the way, I'll talk about my YouTube channel in a minute. You can go on there and get that video. Okay. Now, let me talk a second about this and then we'll open up for questions. So if you're really interested in forensic psychology, I know I'm tooting my own horn. I would recommend, I have a YouTube channel, Forensic Psychology, right? As I tell my kids, I am an influencer. And the funny part of this happened, so I've done some television work. I've done, I was on Discovery Channel, Science Channel. I wrote for TV. I wrote, worked on the development and wrote for a Netflix biography called Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich. That was interesting because they brought me on in July. No, they brought me on in early 2019, and Epstein wasn't charged, wasn't federally charged or arrested until July. So it was before he was a household name. This television production company that I worked for, and this producer I had other stuff with said, hey, we're developing a documentary on this guy named Jeffrey Epstein. He's a rich guy who knew a lot of important people. And all there was on him at that time was he pled plea bargain down a sex offense in 2008. They plea bargained it down to some kind of prostitution, a Florida state case. And he got some favors done for him, favorable. So they were covering that. And so here's one of my quick stories. I was supposed to, so we developed this whole idea series. We're going to do a psychological profile on this guy, blah, blah, blah. And then I was supposed to fly out to Palm Springs, and we're going to do some like filming in front of his mansion, you know. I was supposed to fly it on a Tuesday. Saturday before, I get a text from the producer. Hey, I've been tipped off. He's getting arrested on federal charges. Oh, we're shutting everything down for now. So what happens is they shut everything down, and then this case, you know, obviously blew up, right? Not as much as it is now, but blew up. And then what happened is then after, 6 months when the dust settled, they came back and they said, okay, we're going to change the concept of the show now. We're going to do a little different. And what's really cool, it's on my YouTube channel, they hired private investigators to dig into his background before all this stuff happened. It was real interesting. And there's stuff now that I learned from those private investigators that I'm not seeing in any of the files, which I think is interesting. So, anyway, and then what they did is I wrote a bunch of stuff for the show, and then they told me they weren't going to pay me. I said, you can't use my stuff, and then they did. So if you watch that documentary, there's this 30-ish something female educational psychologist that's talking about grooming. That's all the stuff I wrote. I don't even know if they gave me a credit as a writer on that, but anyway, so they ripped me off. I won't be working for them again. But anyway, a little tangent. How I got into this was right before the pandemic. I had a television production company call me, and they want to do some work with me. And they said, but you don't have a social media presence. And this, we're talking before the pandemic. I said, what's social media presence? What's that? And they said, you need to get on social media. So I started talking to my kids. And they said, get a YouTube channel. And my one kid said, Dad, the stuff you talked about is so interesting. If you go on YouTube, people are going to be interested. So I said, okay. So I did about 6 or 8 videos. Then the pandemic hit. And then those sat there for, I don't know, a few years. And then as time went on and I started to get more interest, I said, maybe I'll play around with this a little bit. So I don't know. I think I got 14,000 subscribers now. And I made $68 last month. So if you're interested in forensic psychology, I just recommend go take a look at it, because there's all kinds. I got 87 videos on there now. Some of it is lectures I've done. A lot of it is somebody writes in. And I just put an Epstein one on yesterday. I got like 12,000 hits on that thing. Pretty cool. That one's going to make me $24, that one. So. But anyway, there's lots of good stuff on there. And I'm on all the other social medias too. But again, if you have a lot of questions about forensic psychology, check it out. It covers a wide range. So, all right, I just talked a lot. Flew through everything. Hope you're not bored. Let's open her up for questions. Yeah, I don't care.
We're going to ask that you ask your question into the microphone, and Dr. Carey has one for that side. So go ahead and raise your hands, and we'll get to you.
Hi, my
Hi.
name is Amy. I'm an adjunct professor here in psychology, but I have a question. For years, I worked at the Muskegon River Youth Home as a chaplain. One of the cases that we had at the time was a 12-year-old, and this was I think he was arrested before the law took place. But anyway, he was a 12-year-old that was involved in a shooting, and he had been tried as an adult and was there until he could be transferred to big prison, right?
Yeah.
But in that particular case, is there any chance of reevaluation after the new statute took place?
Probably not pertaining to competency, but was this person, were they sentenced to life without the possibility of parole?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, and they were a minor.
He was 12.
So.
Not when I met him. He had, I worked with him later on, but he was, I think, 17 or 18 when I was.
So in 2015, some of you might know about this, the Supreme Court ruled on a case called Miller v. Alabama. And what the Supreme Court found was that sentencing juveniles to life without the possibility of parole is against the Constitution. So what happened was 358 guys in Michigan had to be resentenced. So I did a bunch of those evaluations and was running all over the state. And it was usually guys that were convicted in the 90s. Good sociology lessons for you, right? So in the 90s, there was this, it's called the myth of the juvenile predator. There were a bunch of high-profile cases of juveniles committing murders. So what did the politicians do? They overreacted and did a bunch of things called mandatory minimum sentences. You ever heard of those? And what a lot of the states did is they enacted, you could easily move people into adult court, and you could sentence juveniles to life without the possibility of parole. So what happened is, after the Supreme Court decision, all these guys had to be resentenced. So I would have to go do the forensic evaluation, and I'd have to look at things like, were they competent at the time? Didn't make a judgment on that, but how were they able to participate in their defense? And there's 6 criteria the Miller case lays out. were they, are they rehabilitated? So I'll get prison records and have to look through and see if they're rehabilitated. And what the courts can choose, they have a couple choices. They can do, okay, nope, you're staying life without possibility of parole. They can do, we're going to give you 40 to 60. What does that mean? You're eligible for parole at 40. You don't walk at 40. You're eligible for parole. Can't keep you more than 60. You committed the crime at 12, you can get out at 72. Or they can do 25 to 40. And so let's see, a lot of these guys, it was in the 90s, so they've already done 25 years. What will happen is if they're sentenced down, and again, they look at those the 6 factors in the Miller case, and then they can say, okay, you're eligible for parole at 25, and the guy's already done 28, he can apply for parole. I've had them go all different ways. None of the ways that they went, I went, oh man, that's kind of a mistake, because there were some people that I saw that committed pretty heinous acts at 16 or 17, where, and like I have a 17-year-old guy committed a murder. And one of it is the impetuosity of youth. That means the impulsiveness of youth. And another factor is, were they living like an adult? This guy was 17 years old, selling dope, had his own apartment, had 2 cars, had a girlfriend and a baby. He was living like an adult at 17. So anyway, that's what's happening now with that. And I just heard, and now recently, Michigan Supreme Court said, you know what? We're going to move that up to 20. Now I got a letter I'm going to send to Genesee County, because they have 61 people over there out of their county that need to be resentenced, but they need a forensic evaluation. So kind of long-winded answer to that question. Good question. So I wonder if your person, if they got resentenced or if they had to go through that. Google them and see. Yeah. Oh, that's one of the factors, by the way.
Felt that he deserved to be in there, but he just felt so bad for what he did.
Yeah, Google him. See, he might be out or he might be resentenced. Other questions?
You mentioned a few books today. I'm just wondering, for an intro-level psych student interested in forensic psychology, if there's a book you'd recommend they start with?
I don't really have one book to recommend. I'd recommend my YouTube channel. And I'm just not saying that to promote it. But you go on and make your own judgments. There's everything on from how to become a forensic psychologist, types of sex offenders, a regular day. I even did one where I pulled up to the Kent County Jail and put my phone out and talked about what it's like going into prisons as a forensic psychologist and jails. So, you could get a forensic psychology text. I used to teach a course in forensic psychology. It's pretty technical, but I think again, I'm just not self-promoting because I, want to make $100 next month. But I think that channel really covers the broad array. So anyway.
I was just curious if, since you did some psychology studies on Epstein before everything kind of blew up, like now he's out, is there anything that surprised you as things have come more to light in that? Or did you kind of see the forest through the trees as someone who did, looked into things earlier on?
I'll just say this. There's a lot more going on there than just a sex trafficking case. Think about this. This is interesting. So the case is we have a rich guy who was sexually abusing and trafficking young girls. And he's a rich guy and he knows a lot of famous people. We have 6 million pages of federal investigation on him. 6 million. I don't know what's been released already, 120,000 photos, 180,000 photos. That's a lot of law enforcement resources towards one guy in a pretty open and shut case. You got victims, they're testifying. So I think I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there's a lot more going on than just a rich guy who was abusing girls and saying to his buddies, here, here's one for you. There's more going on than that. And one of the things that we learned from the, I don't think I'll get sued for this, but he started out his financial services career. By the way, he had no certifications to do any of this selling of. I mean, you can do that, but he really wasn't trained in finance. One of his earliest investors was a wealthy guy, not a famous guy, who was closeted gay and didn't want anybody to know. And Epstein, the story is, and the rumor is, would set up sexual liaisons for this guy with male prostitutes. This guy invested millions. This guy introduced him to all his friends, who invested millions. And so I think it's interesting that, I don't think my financial guy would do that for me. But you wonder. So what I pondered on that video I put on yesterday was, did he have a business model based on kind of extortion? Because another thing that what we did know too about these parties, he used to have parties in Palm Springs and in New York, and the rumor, according to the private investigator, was that the whole house was wired with cameras. And the famous people, early on, he paid some of the famous people to come to his parties, particularly the academics, Dershowitz, Chomsky, those guys. I don't know if so I don't get sued. I don't know if he specifically paid those guys, but he paid some of these people, particularly academics, to show up at his party. So, did he have an extortion-based business model? Hey, you know that girl that you liked? Well, I hope that doesn't get out. Oh, you want to invest $12 billion with me? Sure. The other part I wonder too, I don't know, working for the federal government for a year as I did, was the federal government one of his clients? Because guess what the federal government used to do? If you read J. Edgar Hoover, they used to set up all these stings. They really went after Martin Luther King, and they were sending girls over to him all the time, and then they would record it. But that's a little illegal. But what they can do is they can pay somebody who's got that information. And I'm really curious if the federal government was interested in what he had on people. And I know my last little weirdo conspiracy thing. I've worked in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. When you're in a suicide prevention cell, particularly when you're a high-profile inmate, you're not going to get an opportunity to kill yourself. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about that, but I know those cells. I used to have to, part of my job was to go see people in those cells. You're not going to kill yourself in those cells, particularly high-profile person. So I don't know anyway, I'll quit talking about that one so I don't get sued or I die in a car explosion on the way home or something.
You said that the statutes for risk assessment and for family law doesn't exist in Michigan. Why is that? And does it exist for other states?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, right, we have a system where different states have different laws. California has a pretty decent law about custody and parenting time and those kind of evaluations. It's not as laid out as much as like the criminal responsibility statute, but it gives better guidelines. Why they don't have it, I think it's kind of hard to define. But so for example, in California, if you want to do those capacity of parent evaluations, you have to get a special certification and get training in law. And actually in California, you're considered what's called a special master, which means you actually have some legal authority over this couple that's divorcing and fighting over their kids. But yeah, I think it's just hard to define. And I also think that maybe the politicians think it's working okay, but it would be nice, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. So, good question though.
How do you get paid? Like, if there's a court order or whatever, or a lot of the people that you're working with, they're not functional members of society, or
that's a good question.
Requiring like a retainer up front. Could you compare it, say, like in family court to like a GAL?
Yeah. So yeah, good question. Who pays me? So in evaluations for the court, frequently I'm paid by the court, by the county. Sometimes the attorney pays me. So particularly if it's a private attorney. Like I'll do work for the public defender's office, Kent County, the federal public defender's office, and then they'll pay me. Sometimes attorneys pay me. Sometimes people have to pay me. Now again, when I do an evaluation for a capacity parent and neglect or abuse case, the state will pay me. So it's from a variety of places. Paramount have to, if you're in trouble and you have money, any money, and you have to come in and get your eval from Dr. Jeff, you're going to have to pay me. Like, for example, probation. Sometimes we'll get an evaluation. A probation officer wants an evaluation. I can't bill your insurance because it's a forensic evaluation. You have to pay. That's mostly how I get paid. Yeah.
Yes. So I have a lot of questions, but yeah. What's changed with forensic psychology, I guess, within past 10 years, really?
What's changed?
Yeah, like what kind of questions are not being asked that probably should?
That's a great question. What's changed? I would say what's changed is there's been some sort of tightening up of what the courts are willing to accept. 10 years ago, any psychologist, exaggerating? No. Any psychologist could go in and say, yeah, my grandma needs a guardian, or this person needs a guardian. They didn't follow statutes. And what's happened is like myself and one of my colleagues, Dr. Julia Cunningham, is a forensic trained psychologist. She knows what she's doing. We've gone into court and helped educate the courts about what needs to happen. I put the juvenile competency. There's a bunch of juvenile competencies coming out of Kalamazoo. And the psychologist doing those had not read the statute and was not given the proper tests. And I got a call from an attorney that said, the guy's not following the statute. Well, can you do it? And I did it, and I went into court and I testified. And part of your job as a forensic psychologist sometimes is to educate the court about the cases and about, at least in that example, the procedures. What happened is the judge went, yeah, you're right. And then we started getting a lot of work out of Kalamazoo County for a long time, still do. So what's changed is it's tightened up a little bit. Standards have tightened up, which is nice. And I'm going to tell you, these guardianships, those can get pretty testy. And I'll give you sort of the stereotyped example. An elderly woman lives on Lake Macatawa. She's got $5 million in the bank. She's got 3 kids. 2 of her kids are nice, and one of her kids is crappy. And the crappy kid says, I want guardianship over mom because she can't take care of her own money. And I had one case like that, and this woman was 79 years old. She used to drive twice a week from Lake Macatawa to East Grand Rapids to meet with all her friends and play bridge. Spoke 4 languages. She was a sharp cookie. And then I did, and I'm like, she doesn't need a guardianship. And then I went into court, and they had some goofy psychologist who reviewed the records and said she did. Didn't even examine her. A little unethical. Not a little, a lot. Anyway, so the guardianships can get a little testy sometimes, particularly when you have, and I'm telling you what, 9 times out of 10, it's one crappy kid out of the 3 or 4. And doesn't talk to their siblings. It's bad family dynamics. And so those can get a little tricky. So I'm really glad that they've tightened up the standards. The courts have tightened up the standards of what they accept as evidence or testimony from mental health professionals.
Hi, I wanted to ask a little bit about risk assessment for sentencing that you had talked about briefly. Yeah. How much variance is there between forensic psychologists doing a risk assessment about the same person? So if a judge had asked you and another forensic psychologist about the same person for a risk assessment, would you guys do you think you'd be pretty close together, or could there be a wide
I would say,
gap?
So for example, 2 psychologists, if they had good training and were forensically trained, and we're calling it like it is, because unfortunately there are some psychologists out there and some who do forensic work that will want to keep the attorney happy. I've never had that. I will never do that. I don't care about making friends with a bunch of attorneys. I'm busy enough. And I'm busy because the judges like my work. So for a forensic risk assessment, again, both psychologists should go in and look at the research literature and say, oh, I need to use an actuarial interviewer protocol. I should use one of those because that's what the research says I should do. I should also do a diagnostic exam to look for particular types of mental health issues or substance abuse, because guess what? That can put you at higher risk. Oh, I need to also review the police reports. All the research tells us that's what we need to do. And read the type of offense can increase your risk. So if you do a risk assessment and you don't read the police report, and the guy said, oh yeah, well, yeah, she was 15, but she told me she was 18 online, and then you find out she was 9. From a scientific perspective on the research on sex offending, we know the offenders of 9-year-olds are typically, that's a higher risk level than someone who offends against 15-year-olds. So yeah, it should be the same if people are well trained and they're following the same procedures in order to do those evaluations. Use a microphone so we can get it on the camera. For all the live streaming folks, right?
Have you ever done like evaluations of other psychologists in like a criminal or like a forensic setting?
Great question. Kinda. I don't know. Oops, okay, I don't have it up there. One of the things when I had the broad area of forensic psychology, fitness for duty evaluations. There's some legal aspects to that. I've had to evaluate a few psychologists now for their fitness for duty. Can they do the work of a psychologist, or are they impaired due to some type of mental disease or other mental health problem? I haven't evaluated any psychologists who've done crimes. Oh, I did. No, I had one. He was having sex with a patient. And that's a crime. That's sexual abuse. I had to evaluate him. So yeah, a couple. That's always an interesting evaluation, I'll tell you that much, right? But we can usually get down to what we need to get down on, because even though you've had all the psychological training, can you fake your way out of it? No, not if you've been an experienced examiner.
Kind of piggybacking off of like the like technical sorry, my brain's not working. Okay, going back to like family, and I saw one of your like bullet points kind of for criteria being like a child being old enough or having the ability to decide which parent they kind of like want to be with. How is that determined? Because like I've been in a situation, with my own family, and that was always kind of something I wondered when they decided you were able to choose without the influence of a parent. So I was kind of wondering what the process looked like for that.
So what she's talking about, it would take too much time to get that back up. If you remember, I had a slide that had the Michigan custody factors. There were 12 or 13 factors that the judge needs to take into account. That's what you're talking about. One of those factors said the age of the child to provide input into custody and parenting time decisions. So how does that work? Well, the psychologist, I always refuse to evaluate children in the middle of custody, because I always said it's not the kid's problem, it's the parent problem. But the way they do that, and the way I know this, is a law firm 10 years ago surveyed all the judges on how they decide all those factors. And the judges just kind of wing it. And the judge goes, and it depends on, but the judge did say it depends on the kid. So if you have a 12-year-old, the judge might bring them in. They also said when they bring kids in, they weigh the relevance of that piece of evidence, because that's what it is at this point, based on the kid, based on the kid's age. Some judges said, I don't bring anyone in under 12. So they do that by, I don't know if they get that guidance from their professional associations. I don't know if they get it because they talk amongst themselves, but the judge is the one who decides to bring the kid in or not. And when you looked at, I think there were 6 family court judges at the time, and most of them said not under 12. Most of them said it's case-by-case basis. So that's the way that works.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Jeff.
Well, I'll stay another hour.
Oh, great. Yes, can we give him a round of applause, please? Thank you. And I hope to see some of you at our next speaker. It's on Thursday, April 9th at 1 o'clock. And you can go to the psychology website, and then we'll have the information about the speaker there for you. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you so much.
yeah, it's fun.